Hello, hello, and welcome to Roots and Branches Adoption Stories here on K-Fred Radio. I'm Janet Munro. I'm a birth mother, a storyteller, or better yet, a listener of stories. And I'm someone who believes that every adoption story deserves to be heard from every side. Today's guest is an author, a researcher, and an adoptee. She was adopted in 1965 into what looked like the perfect family from the outside. Educated parents, stability, opportunity, and love. She grew up knowing she was adopted. In fact, I heard that as a young girl, when she was meeting new people, she would skip over to them and proudly say, "I'm Jean, I'm adopted." But as Jean grew older, she began to realize that many of the struggles that she faced throughout her life traced back to one central reality: adoption itself. Not because she hated her adoptive family. In fact, she openly says that she had a good life. But adoption can hold both love and loss at the same time. Jean went on to interview more than 100 people connected to adoption for her book, The Adoption Paradox, exploring adoptee trauma, birth mother grief, attachment, identity, open versus closed adoption, and the modern adoption industry itself. Today we're talking about adoption, then and now. We're talking about what happens when a baby is separated from everything familiar. What adoptive parents should understand before bringing a child home, and whether adoption today is truly centered on the needs of the children. This is an emotional, educational, and deeply honest conversation, and I think it is one that every adoptee, every birth parent, adoptive parent, and hopefully adoptive parents should hear. So let's welcome Jean Widner to Roots and Branches Adoption Stories. And Jean, I am so glad to have you here. You know, when we talked in that pre-interview, we talked about 40 things that we could talk about today. And just being on here with you and trying to think of how we can put 40 things in 1 hour, it's almost impossible. I think you have to agree with that. So we'll kind of stick to some subjects. And I am sure at the end of this conversation, we're going to be discussing a future date for you to come back. So welcome. As I said, I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you, Janet. I'm so glad that we found each other and got connected. And thank you for having me on your program. And I'm excited to begin this very fun, enjoyable, hard, all the things conversation.
I have my Kleenex handy.
Yes, good idea. Me too.
So let's start with the beginning. 1965, you were adopted. What did it take to adopt a baby in 1965?
Yeah. You know, I always feel like I have to start first with my natural mother story. I mean, she graduates from high school in a tiny town in North Dakota, has a boyfriend. She gets pregnant that summer. And unfortunately, I don't think she has a great, home life, at least the picture that is painted by the non-identifying information, which is all I'm allowed to have from the Salvation Army. It looks like she has some troubles in her family and her boyfriend won't marry her. And so, like so many other girls of her era, she is sent away. I believe on her mother's side of the family, she has a great aunt in Spokane, Washington, which I believe is how she ended up there at a Booth Memorial Salvation Army Hospital. There were a number of those up and down the West Coast. And that's where I was born. And so she relinquishes me, I believe, about 10 days after birth. I'm fostered, I don't know where, for 2 months. And then my parents, George and Mary and Kelly, come and get me. And that's how I came to be with the family I was. That random chance of lining up with my file and their file in the same adoption agency at the same moment, right?
Yes. And then you went to live with them, and was that in Washington?
Yes, I grew up and was raised in Yakima, Washington. So that's my hometown, for all practical purposes. And it
And
was
how was
mostly,
life with those parents?
yeah, it was, you know, again, mostly idyllic, at least on the outside. We lived in a cute little house. There was a park at the bottom of the street. I had lots of friends, lots of activities. Um, I struggled a bit in school, as many kids do, many adopted kids do. And it, we were on the outside a great family. My dad was an educator by trade. He was a PhD, a school psychologist, and he genuinely loved kids. So I knew he genuinely wanted to be a dad. My mom was a registered nurse. Um, and that was, of course, the more complicated relationship. One of the things that I think is maybe some of the things that my parents got right, which I talk about a lot. I mean, they got a lot right in adoption. Not through any kind of guidance or formal awareness or training, but just running on instinct and running on the fact that, again, like I said, my dad genuinely liked kids and wanted to be a dad. He was also, though, the one who was sterile, and so they knew that because he had gone in the army. And in the 1950s, hey, put it in a cup, son, we're going to run that sperm count test. And so they had already told him, listen, this isn't going to be you're not going to be a natural father. So he knew that by the time he was courting my mother. And so my parents do not come to adoption with that sort of really incredible grief story, and the painful story of either infertility that is undiagnosed or not understood, or being unable to carry to term, and that league of miscarriages that so many women do so painfully suffer from, and their partners too. So grief isn't what brings them to me. And so I'm lucky in that regard. And what that did, though, is it did sort of set the table for the fact that my father was unashamed of the fact that I was theirs. And it, I think, made it somewhat easier for my mother. The relationship with my mother is, of course, the complicated one thing. She, herself comes from a long line of unmothered women on her side of the family. She was already pretty meaningfully addicted to prescription drugs and alcohol before I even came into the picture. And as a registered nurse, was really, really good at hiding that. My father was not looking too carefully at the fact that he had a pharmacy inside of his own home, because mother literally had probably 50 to 100 different, prescription pill bottles. She was managing her depression with all sorts of things. And so what that unfortunately created is a situation where I'm coming to them, of course, as an adoptee who, at the time, everyone believes is that it's blank slate. Nothing that happens before conscious memory takes hold matters. And my father believed that because that was the psychological opinion of the day, and so therefore did my mother. But my mother's, I think, very deep seated insecurity and her very deep seated depression and unhappiness with her own life made it so that she couldn't be the respite for me that my needs are so desperately wanting. And then the way that manifested as I grew is she was just so incredibly inconsistent. I say in my book, I never knew from even morning to day, much less day to day, which mommy I had waiting for me. I could wake up in the morning and she'd be happy, and then I'd come home from school and she'd be in a rage. And all I did was changed into my play clothes and headed out into the neighborhood park or over to a friend's house as quickly as I could. So um, that was really painful. I realize it's funny because now I can look back at my teen years in particular and I can realize how lonely I really was. Because again, my parents supported the idea of me bringing up my natural mother or talking about adoption. I wasn't shy about the fact that I was adopted. They did a good job of framing all of that up for me. But then, even still, because I can't talk about the fact that my mother's crazy, I can't talk about the fact that I'm theirs, but I'm not. And as you start to settle that in, of course, as you age, that takes different forms. And so I still ended up dealing with all of the consequences of that silence, which, creates this deep seated feelings of unworth in me. Um, and just, again, a very fundamental sense of insecurity because I really didn't have anybody who was really, that I was bonded to, that I was connected to, that I felt genuinely safe with. And so I think that is the really hard thing that I'm still working through at this point. So,
How did they treat the fact about your birth mother when you asked about her?
that is one of the things that they really got right. Um, I was always really grateful for that. My parents would say things to me like, I mean, of course, there's age appropriate things. This conversation changes as you get older, but by the time I was a teenager, they would say things to me like, we're really not sure that she had a choice. They would say she was young, she was unmarried, and I don't know what choices she even had available to her, and that was a relatively revolutionary thing for parents to be saying to their adopted child in the mid 1970s. And so I'm grateful for that. There's a funny story that I've written about and talked about, which is, many adoptees kind of in our teen years, which is, you hit that rebellious time anyway, right? So, of course, a lot of us fling this whole, I'm going to go off and find my real parents, or I'm going to go off and find my real mom, someday. Um, and, when I would fling that at my dad, he would just be like, great. I hope you find her someday. I'd love to meet her. I'd love to thank her, and that was so profound because when you think about that, it, number one, takes all the gasoline out of my flamethrower. That doesn't land as a painful intimidation. But what it taught me, is that he was unafraid. Again, it reinforced that fact that they're not feeling weird about the fact that they adopted a child. They're not insecure about that.
Right.
And so it told me that dad lived in a place of truth in particular, and I knew my mother did too. They lived in a place of truth. And then also when I, again, think about, the grace that extends to my natural mother and the fact that it's like, yeah, I'd love to meet her someday. I'd love to know more about who she is. I mean, again, I think that's a really almost revolutionary kind of a thing for a man in particular in that era to be saying to someone. So I'm very grateful for that.
I know that my son's adoptive parents always let him know that he was adopted, and he grew up knowing he was adopted. And they would always tell him that he was adopted out of love because his mother could not raise him the way she thought he should be raised. And when I did meet her, she did say thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for giving me a son. And she also adopted a daughter as well. And so she had the perfect family life, mom, dad, son, and daughter on that.
Let me ask you this as a first mother. How did that make you feel having an adopted parent thank you?
It shocked me,
Hmm.
but I was grateful to hear it because I knew I'd done the right thing.
Hmm.
Yeah, it
So it
made
gave
me.
you some solace.
Yes, yes. And when I met my son, one of the things he wanted to know was more about certain attributes that he had as to where they came from. So one of the things he said was he took the washing machine apart, and his dad was in no way handy. And so he came home one day and Dwayne had the washing machine all apart and had to put it all back together again. And he wanted to know where that trait came from. But my dad was an electrical engineer and always taking things apart and putting them back together. And
Huh.
he got to know where certain things came from, what made him who he was, because he was different. And there is a difference between nature and nurture.
Yep.
But I have to say, when I met him, he was an amazing young man, and the adoptive parents nurtured him so well because he was so giving to everyone. And I was really, truly blessed that he turned out the way he did.
Good. I'm glad for that. I'm glad that that's a good story for you.
Yeah, no, it's a good story. And, even though he's gone, I keep imagining that one day he and I are going to walk along a beach on a tropical island side by side and catch up on all the years that we missed.
Mm.
So, and
That's
one
a
day,
nice thought. Anyway,
but as
sorry.
a birth mom, I was a birth mom in 1970, and I was going to be 21 when I gave birth. So I was the one who made the choice to put him for adoption. It was a one night stand. I was not marrying the gentleman. We'd be divorced within a year, and I'd still be a single mom. And at that point in time, divorce and unwed mothers were all looked at the same way with shame because it was all
Right.
our fault, right? We were the ones that were responsible.
Entirely our fault.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Couldn't It didn't matter. We were the ones that enticed this to happen. So
Yes. Yes.
I did the right thing, putting him up for adoption. When I first spoke to him and he told me that I had 3 grandchildren and 5 great grandchildren, that blew my world apart. And it took me back to those emotions. And it was like this tsunami of emotions just going through everything from back then because you blocked it off for so long. And all of a sudden, it's 46 years later, and I get to remember everything and see what I've missed. And that really hurt that you've missed all this. But when you get
Right.
through that, you realize you wouldn't have the life you have today if things had been different. And I was blessed to be married to a good man, to have 2 other children. We welcomed Wayne into our life, and he welcomed us. He said, "There's no such thing as half brothers, half sisters. You're just my brother and my sister." And everything was good. And he also got the opportunity to meet his dad's side of the family, which gave him 6 brothers and sisters as well.
Wow.
So
I'm
made it,
glad. I'm glad you have that good story. That's
yeah,
cool.
it made a huge difference to him. So,
Sure.
but you've gone on to write a book called The Adoption Paradox. And I have to be honest and say, I haven't got through the whole book yet. It seems every time I pick it up, I start to go back to my next chapter, but then I go back to the beginning and start over again because there's so much information in that book and so much that you need to understand.
Hmm.
How did you get into that? What made you go that route?
Oh gosh. um, I as I started to open myself up to even searching, which didn't happen until very, very recently. I mean, it was literally 2020 when I decided that I would search. Then that started to kick open a lot of other emotions, obviously, because for many adoptees, even, and certainly for myself, it's like even the declaration that, okay, now I'm ready to do this thing when maybe I wasn't prior to that, that in and of itself is a pretty monumental internal shift. And so as I kicked that open and started to go out and read, some of the books that have been written out there, Anne Fessler's The Girls Who Went Away, All You Can Ever Know, some of the other memoirs and things that were out there. There was good memoir, there was good research, but I didn't see anything that tried to actually tell the stories from all sides of adoption because you know there's to say that it's complicated is a massive understatement. It is massively complicated because you have adoptees with their truth, you have our relinquishing, first parents with their truth, and then you have the adoptive parents. And all of these sides and experiences are just so vastly different, but deserve to be heard from. And I felt like that was what I needed to have. Was I knew I wanted research in there because I am my father's daughter for sure. And by that I mean the father who raised me, because he's the only one I know. That's definitely him, showing up in there. Is that I knew I wanted psychological research to back up what people were saying, but I also knew I wanted story to bring it to life from all sides. And I honestly ran on instinct. I ran on the idea that I wanted this book. I didn't see it out there. And so I audaciously and maybe foolishly decided that I was going to create it. And, that was a very humbling task to undertake. So I tried to get it right. I tried my best.
I think your goal and mine are very similar because that's why I started Roots and Branches, because every adoption has a story, be it the
Yeah,
adoptee, the birth parents, or the adoptive parents, or even aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, grandparents. They all have stories to do with it, and they all need to be
right.
told because everything affects people differently.
Right, which is
And
why
I,
we've moved away from language talking about just the triad and moved into language encompassing a constellation, right?
right. So we both have the same goals in mind, and I'm doing mine over podcasts, and you did yours with the book and the interviews and things like that, and through your Adoption Paradox webpage. So,
Mm-hmm.
so let's go on to one of the things we talked about was adoption today, how it compares to adoption back then. Back then, okay, for my son was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Mm-hmm.
He was adopted straight from the hospital within 10 days of birth. And 2 weeks after he was adopted, there was a train load with 40 babies that went from Winnipeg to Minneapolis because we had too many babies in Winnipeg and not enough people to adopt. I have no idea what happened to that trainload of babies that ended up in Minneapolis, but I've spoken to someone who remembers it. But would they have just been adopted as they were, or what would have happened to them? Do you know?
Right.
For an adoption train?
Yeah, that's, I'm wondering if that would be classified as a part of the black market that was most definitely happening between Canada and into the US. I interviewed a good friend of mine who's also a fellow author, Diana Hochberg, who is herself a black market baby coming out of Canada. And she has her story called Connected. And there's quite a bit of evidence that there were quite a few children who were being marketed across that border. As we know, unfortunately, children have been trafficked all over the world into various countries, not just the US, but in others, in the name of, infant adoption. And so it is it is definitely a truth that these efforts have been mobilized supposedly for the benefit of children, but have often, unfortunately, just really looked an awful lot like human trafficking and an awful lot like black market activities. So I can't comment on your specific story, except that unfortunately it is not isolated.
So when you were adopted, was yours done all legally
Oh
through a
yes,
lawyer
yes,
and through an agency?
I am a legal adoption to the best of my knowledge anyway at this point. Yes.
All right, so mine was a legal adoption as well. I know that much. But how does it compare to today? How do people, adoptive parents, find children today? And what does it take to become an adoptive parent today?
Wow. Today, unfortunately, in the United States in particular, we have what is essentially an online marketplace for babies. What you have is a scenario where we have roughly 20,000, give or take, infants, and let's be specific here first and foremost. We're talking about the infant adoption industry, and it is an industry, and that's creepy even to say, but we're just talking about that. We are not talking about foster care, where a child is removed because they are supposedly potentially unsafe in their household. So we're setting that entire process aside right now, and we're just talking about infant adoption. So in the US, we have a fundamental imbalance between supply and demand. We have many, many, many parents, as many as a million, maybe sometimes more, who are actively waiting to adopt an infant in the United States. And we have roughly 20,000 said infants who will become available to adopt. And so that imbalance that exists right now is the most dramatic numerically that has ever existed since infant adoption has been practiced. And what it has created in the United States, where we have a privatized and even for-profit industry in America. You now have you have roughly 1,000 adoption agencies here in the United States, or by that I also mean attorneys, right? So legally licensed facilitators of adoption. Okay, you have roughly 1,000 practitioners of infant adoption providers, and you have 70% of those who are registered as nonprofits. The other 30% are openly for profit. And you have 1 million hopeful couples. So, what that equates to is for every infant who becomes available, you have 35 to 50 prospective adopters and adoptive parents, but adopters is the technical industry term, who are competing against each other in an online marketplace, and they pick me, pick us, we're the right people to raise your child. And that's creepy. I'm just going to say it. If you go to any adoption facilitator website out there, you will see advertisements basically for hopeful couples who are looking to adopt an infant that have pretty pictures of their lives, their little story, who we are, why we're looking to adopt a child, blah, blah, blah. And then you have that agency's intake process to attract an expectant parent who, for whatever reasons, is pondering adoption. So that's how adoption happens now in the United States. You do also have some of the wild, wild west, very informal, which is usually not legal things that are happening on social media, where you actually have paid sponsored ads being placed by prospective adoptive parents or hopeful adoptive parents, saying, we'd love to, we're great people. If you're struggling, we'd love to talk, that kind of thing. That's happening out there, even though it's not legal in most states, but in some states they actually haven't yet caught up on legislation to define it as not okay. So yeah, there's a lot of avenues out there, and unfortunately, there's great variance from state to state as to what is legal or not, and we have an online marketplace. That's where we're at.
What age are women giving up their children now?
Yeah, that's a big shift. The demographics about who is relinquishing and why is a huge shift. Back when you relinquished, back when my mother relinquished, back all the way going from basically, the end of World War II into 1973, which is the passage of Roe v. Wade, relinquishing young women in general. Okay, whenever you say that, there's problems out there. I know there's going to be people who can say, no, not that, that's not my story. But in general, what you had were young, unmarried women, 16, 17, 18, sometimes 19, 20, 21 years of age, who are relinquishing simply because society is just saying, no, you can't be a single parent. You just can't do that. We don't do that. That's not okay. And so you either got married or you gave up your baby. That was it. No other choices. What we have now is the average age that a woman is considering relinquishing her child is 26. 58% of those women are already parenting one child. 20% of them are married. And what's driving it isn't societal shame over single parenting. We have single parents all around us, fathers and mothers. But what is driving it now is a lack of resources in general. You certainly do have times when you have other problems that are going on between a young couple. Maybe you have, significant instability caused by other factors. But the core issue is usually a lack of resources. And so that is what is different, is our demographics have completely shifted. This is now a grown woman. She's on her own. She's renting an apartment, and she's usually already a single mother of one. And now she's pregnant again for whatever reasons, however that relationship has evolved, what that looks like. She's not feeling financially stable enough to support a second child.
What happens to the 15 and 16-year-olds that get pregnant. I'm sure they're still out there.
They are. There's fewer of them than there ever have been. I mean, I know I saw a report that was released late last year that said that, teen pregnancy rates are the lowest that they've ever been. And so, I don't know any research on that in terms of like how many are kept, how many are relinquished, what happens on that. There are other resources, and researchers who have leaned into that data more than I have. It happens, but it happens far less than it has in a long time. We're like at the lowest rate of teen pregnancy since before the 1990s. So, which is a good thing, right?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. That means that the men know about condoms and the women do as well. They know how to say no.
Yeah, one hopes.
Yes. You have mentioned that today it's the adoption industry is $1 billion industry.
Mhm.
What facts do you have to say that?
Oh, goodness. I mean, this is where we do need to back up and, take a 30,000-foot view here. You have the child welfare and adoption industry in America, which this is, ergo foster care, right? Child welfare is foster care. So with those two needs combined, you have a $26 billion industry and climbing. It's estimated it'll be at 30 billion very soon, within a couple of years of now. So that is unfortunately climbing. Within that number, the majority of that is definitely foster care providers, which again, we're going to get really creepy here because in America, our states have started to outsource our foster care providing processes to not only nonprofit organizations, but for profit organizations. And so it is a $26 billion a year industry and growing. Now, what you have within that is, again, the plenary infant adoption industry. What I can say to you is it's hard to get anybody to give you that number, but the average cost of an adoption these days is $45,000. If you take $45,000 and multiply that by 20,000, you're very close to $1 billion. Some adoptions cost more, some do cost less, but it's $1 billion a year industry. $1 billion changed hands last year, placing 20,000 infants in America into homes. That is, in and of itself, I think, a disturbing statistic. And it's something that people should be aware of and have to sit with for a little bit.
It is definitely an alarming statistic.
Yeah.
And I do have to sit with it because it's not something that's easy to believe because that's human trafficking, right? Child trafficking, baby trafficking.
It's a gut punch. It's very frustrating when we look at our larger context around this, which again, if the primary reason for this is a lack of resources, but then adoptive parents are being asked to again provide so much money for a child, how do it, this just gets very morally squishy and very morally uncomfortable very quickly here. And, against that backdrop is this cadence of that either it is a child who is in need of a good home, or you also again do unfortunately have, I think, some adoptive parents that are coming at this from I think when you have really deep grief surrounding this brought about due to infertility, which is where a lot of plenary infant adoption comes from, is you've got a lot of really undealt with or unrecognized emotional pain. I don't think people can make good decisions. I don't think they're making decisions from their most rational place. And I also don't think that they're making holistic decisions. I think adoptive parents or prospective parents in that space are really thinking of themselves. They're thinking of their need and their desire to be parents. And I get that. It is deeply embedded into our DNA to procreate, to continue the species. I do not in any way shame them for their desires. And, you know, we talk in the book and we talk a lot in this space about disenfranchised grief, about the unrecognized grief that I think so many within this constellation are living within. You have the again the hopeful adopters, so forgive some of that terminology, but I'm gonna put it where it is. They're hopeful adopters, being driven by grief that isn't being dealt with in a protective way. You have a relinquishing birth mother who is in significant emotional distress, and a lot of that is driven by resources and a lack of support. And by that I don't just mean um, the support that she's needing in terms of finances, but also like emotional support, like someone in her corner. And then you have the unrecognized grief of an infant who loses their biological connection to their mother. So everyone, I think, in the franchise, or excuse me, is suffering from disenfranchised grief. And our society then doesn't get it. And our society stays focused on the idea that there's an assumption that any child that is placed for adoption needed to be so, that they were somehow unwanted, and that this woman didn't want to parent or couldn't parent. And then we tend to place adoptive parents universally on a pedestal and say, well, look at what they're doing. They're willing to raise, a child that isn't theirs biologically. And, how good they must be, because look at all that they did. They did the home study and they did all the things, right? And then some woman chose them, right? So goody on them. And we tend to make this teeter-totter go very, very one way, with the relinquishing mother on the bottom of it, and the adoptive parents are always assumed to obviously be good people and good parents on the top. And the truth is everybody's human and we're all somewhere in between. And so again, we're failing to recognize the complexity of what's really going on here, and we're failing to recognize what is actually motivating both the relinquishment and why people are adopting. And so then we fail. And somebody makes a lot of money.
Yes, I remember when I had, before I had Dwayne, and then after I had Dwayne, I ended up with 2 miscarriages plus a ectopic pregnancy. And at the time when I had the ectopic, the doctor said to me, "Oh, if you need help, we can help you." And I thought to myself, no, if I'm not meant to have children, I'm not going to have children. That's the way. I've already had one, and maybe this is God telling me you can't have any more, right? But I was blessed to have 2 children after that, and I consider myself very grateful for that. I never would have looked at adoption, and I think I wouldn't have looked at it because I had put a child up for adoption, so I would think that I was not meant to have children. But I can understand where adopted parents are coming from, the grief of having gone through so much trauma and not having what they wanted, which was their own family. And it has to me, it has to be difficult to adopt, because you have to, that child, you have to treat as your own, and you've got to give it unconditional love and spend that time with them so they know that. in order to nurture them in such a way that they can, how can you put it? The children should not have to feel gratitude. The parents can be grateful that they have a child, any way that they can have a child, right? But it has to be in such a way that the child is number one, and the
Right.
needs of the child is number one.
Are you willing to sit with me on a few things that I want to just share with you? I'm not sure if you've gotten there in the book, but what you're describing for your own journey is what is known as secondary infertility, which is that you, by relinquishing, you know, cannot carry to term again or have another child. That is a completely unstudied topic among birth parents. We don't know how often it happens, but it's not as uncommon as you think it is. And so just going to leave that there with you. You'll get to it in the book.
All right.
But okay, you'll get there, but you're not alone in that. And I will say, and I'm glad that you've been able to view this all through the lens that you're able to at this point in your life's journey. And I'm glad that you did get to parent, with your husband and partner and all of those things. I'm glad that you had that human experience. And I'm also going to carry forward now to what you were saying about, adoptive parents need to provide a child unconditional love. And I'm going to say to you, yes, they do. And it's not enough. I received unconditional love. It is not enough.
What are you missing?
I'm sorry?
You say it's not enough, so what are you missing? What's the part that you're missing?
The part that is missing is my nervous system has still been traumatized by the separation from my natural mother, and I need actual healing on that. And if parents don't have that awareness and something that's going to actually help heal that primal wound, as we often call it, right, due to Nancy Verrier's book, but this jar to our nervous system is devastating to that infant. And I think sometimes we get lucky. I think sometimes some of that grief and some of that damage to our nervous system can be overwritten through really exceptional trauma informed parenting. I think it can happen. I think sometimes it does happen, maybe a little bit by accident, where a mother is deeply available and open to bond with this infant, and that infant is coming to her a little bit maybe more resilient or a little bit more open and available to bond to her. A lot of that depends on the in utero experience there. There's that whole section in my book where we talk about the first 1,000 days. And the truth is we do have neuroplasticity. Those things that damage can gradually be overwritten, but it takes time and it takes the right kind of parenting. And so love is not enough. It's not. Love is not enough. And what's ironic is that natural mothers are often told, well, all you have is love. It's not enough. And then our adoptive parents are told, just take the kid home and love it. Everything will be great. And so it's not enough. And it's not love from our parents, love from God or whatever. It's like it can't. You need to be working on the nervous system. You need to actually be working on the trauma, and rewiring that. And for some people, that's more possible than others. In some families, that's more possible than others. And I think that that's why you have this vast variance in the adoptee population, where you have either those of us who are educated or those of us who are also, saying like, listen, I have never felt right in this earth and in this body and in this family and in this situation. They have always felt traumatized. And then you have other adoptees who will say, I don't know what you're talking about. And there's a difference between understanding trauma that happened to the nervous system and then feeling traumatized, right? Especially as grown-ups and adults. But I still have yet to talk to an adopted adult where when you start to describe the symptoms of what trauma looks like and the way that that gets manifested into our bodies, I have yet to talk to that adopted individual who doesn't share some of that in them, because so much of it looks like success. So much of it looks like our perfectionistic, our striving, our good little adoptee, sort of hardwiring, where we just decide this is our job. We're just going to go along to get along because that's what everybody wants me to be, because I am so lucky and so privileged and so this, that, and the other thing. And I have such great parents, of course. And that's what our society puts on us. And we just decide we're going to embrace the role, sometimes to the point where we no longer even are capable of seeing it. So
You feel that children should know from day one that they are adopted?
without question, that's not even a yes. Unequivocally, universally, yes.
Yes. Be honest with them from the very beginning and let them know.
Yes.
All right. So I was talking to a lady last week who found out at the age of 7 that she was adopted.
Mm-hmm.
Her adoptive mom came home from the hospital with her brother. And her dad sat her down. She was so excited to have a brother, but her dad took her to one side and sat her down and said, you did not grow in mommy's tummy the same way as your brother has. Your brother is my real son. You're not my real daughter. You're not real. And that was a 7-year-old who had this traumatic experience, but did not even understand what trauma was.
Right.
And from then on, she's thought she was not real.
Yeah. What a terrible thing to say. Some of the things that have been said to adoptees over the eons they just take my breath away.
Yeah. And then she suffered from physical and emotional abuse from then on. Christmas time, everything went to the son and nothing to the daughter, and just differences in life. And she moved schools, and then she went to another school, and she met a girl there that was adopted, and she was in tears when she told me. She said, Janet, I met this girl, she was adopted, and she was so loved. Her mother was there, every mother and daughter, her mom was there. She was just so loved, and then there was me. And I wasn't real.
What a shame.
So
I hope she heals.
5 years ago, she got rid of the last gentleman because she tended to pick father figures. And she got rid of him, and she's been working on herself for the last 5 years now. So she suffered with that for like 45 years until she started working on herself.
Right.
And she's actually amazing. She's so strong. Now that she knows that she is real, she's just so strong. So I'm going to refer her to you and get her onto your website. And that I think she'd like to hear everything you have to say, and you'll make her stronger. And that's the whole idea of these stories that we're telling, right? It's to give people the strength to be able to tell their stories and know. So I know you've looked for your birth mom. You've actually located her, but at this point in time, she doesn't. You don't have a relationship with her, correct?
Yes, that's correct, unfortunately.
But I think that's because of the time as well. Back then, she might not have had a choice, as you say, like you don't really know what happened to her. Mm-hmm. But as a birth mom from that time, I know how we were made to feel, that it didn't matter. We were trash, basically. We were a disgrace to the family.
Yeah. I
know in the time that I was pregnant, I was put into a home it was just a family, and I looked after the 2 girls. that they had, babysitting, things like that. It was just a home to go to. And my dad would pick me up every Sunday to take me home for dinner. I had no conversation with my dad from the time he picked me up in the car to the time we got home. He would not talk to me the whole time unless I had a friend come for dinner, and then she'd start a conversation. And then at the end of the night, he would put me in the car and he would take me back. And again, no conversation, no kiss goodbye, nothing. It was just drop me off and there I was, and that happened all. And then after it was over, after Dwayne was born and he didn't come home with me, and things went back to the way they were.
Oh my God.
And I always wondered, actually, I shouldn't say I always did, but it was sort of in the last year of his life when I started to wonder, did he not talk to me because he felt guilty? Because he hadn't helped me and hadn't been able to do what he felt he should have as a dad? Was that part of the reason that he wasn't speaking to me? And I never got to ask him that because he was gone before I'd actually found Dwayne and able to go back to all those feelings that I had back then. So your mom might have gone through something similar. It might have been such a disgrace for her, such a shame that she's afraid to go back and go through all those feelings, especially if she has a partner who doesn't know and she hasn't talked about it. Because I know I never talked about it for 46 years. All of a sudden I have a son. How do you tell people that there's another man in your life? No, none of my friends knew. My daughter did know, but nobody else knew. And all of a sudden I've got this gentleman who's coming to visit, and I have to let people know. So I ended up going on Facebook and putting my story in there, and I told it over a few days, a kind of a little spiel every day about my summer of 1969 and how I got pregnant and what happened, and that I'd actually found my son. By the end of the story, there was hundreds of people reading it, so that was great. And people knew and could understand it. But really, when it happens, all of a sudden, you've got this story and nobody knows. How do you tell it?
Right. Right.
How do you tell family? How do you let people know and understand what you went through? And it's very difficult to do that. So I do empathize with your mom because I know things are difficult. I know of another lady who was in BC, and she did find her birth parents. Her mom was 16 when she was born. Her dad was 15. And they were told to forget about her birth, that it was over and done with. The baby was taken from her, and they shouldn't even think about it. And then she found out that two of them did get married later in life. They had no more children. And she did see them a couple of times, stayed with them. But when she left, she said it was very difficult when she left because they felt like they were losing her all over again. Yeah. So she only met with them 2 or 3 times before they didn't want to contact anymore because it was too emotional for them. And she didn't think her mom had grown emotionally from the day that she was born. So it's very, very difficult for birth parents to come to terms with it. It took me a while to come to terms with it. But I don't have any regrets. I look back and I said, okay, this is what happened. And I tell my story now, and I'm not ashamed anymore because I'm not the only one it happened to. There's lots of us out there, and we should all be able to tell the story.
Right.
And be honest about it because it's our life. And we can't have any regrets because we can't change what happened. We just have to go forward and look forward to the next day, right? So I think I'm okay with myself. But I'm sure you can probably point out some things that are wrong with my thoughts. But yeah, as I said, we can't change it. We have to live with it.
Right. No, that's entirely true. And, your thoughts and your position are your own, everyone has to be able to go through this and own their own piece of their own story in the way that they have assimilated this into their being now. And that may continue to evolve and change, throughout our lives. So, and it's not my business to tell anybody what they ought to feel or what they ought to think. My business is to try to report on where things are, and to try to share what I learned in both my research and from, listening to other people's and their points of view. And there are, I think, a great many birth parents, I'll just use the term, who are in very different places of, how they have reconciled, whatever happened to them, and however that happened. And I do also want to say, I'm really sorry that your family treated you like they did. That's terrible. That's horrendous for all of you. I mean, what happened, I think, was really quite barbaric to a great many of our parents. And I think that is such a shame. And it is indeed like this stain that continues to try to, something that we try to heal from, and the first antidote is to shed that secrecy, to shed the shame and the secrecy and, what got placed on top of people that was so incredibly unfair. So that's the first step, no matter what, for both our larger society and us as individuals, I think.
So today, what advice would you give to people who are looking to adopt?
Really make sure that you know your why on this, and it's not about you. If you are coming at this thinking that this is your solution to your pain over infertility, or just, you're called by God, or that you just want to grow your family, whatever your reasons are, they need to be based around the actual needs of the child that you will bring home. I would say, please consider adopting out of foster care over infant adoption, just because I'm not sure that we are actually practicing this ethically. I'm really not. And, you have genuine need from children where parental rights have been terminated. And I find it interesting that, it's very easy for people to accept the idea that a child is traumatized coming out of foster care. They find it much more difficult to accept that we are coming to them traumatized, having been separated from our mothers as infants. But both things are, both things are traumatizing. And so, again, adoption isn't going anywhere. And we need to keep striving to actually be some relinquishments are necessary. Sometimes you have too many problems to solve. But if the only problem that you're solving is resources, these people have some and this person doesn't, that's not an equal equation. And so we really do need to, as a society and then as individuals, really look at this and make sure that you understand what your motivations actually are. And that, again, it is not about you. It will never be about you. It should not be about you. It should actually only be for the actual genuine welfare of this child. And if you're not in for that, do me a favor and reconsider. Really think this through. And I would always say, I wish so bad that we had some sort of a mandate in our country where that you could not adopt until you'd been through at least 6 or 12 months, maybe with an adoption competent and informed therapist to be looking at you and to be helping you along the way, if that becomes an actual path that you pursue. If I were queen of the universe, that would be one of the things that I would say we need to have in place. And my understanding is that is the case in Canada. So I think it can be done. I think it should be done, because again, and it does need to be an adoption competent therapist, someone who is trauma informed and someone who is very, very aware of both the long-term and the short-term considerations. So that's my advice. And I know that that's maybe not what a lot of prospective adoptive parents want to hear, but I think it's actually for the good of families to have that be a part of your language and a part of your thought process.
I think they need to hear it. They need to
I
hear it
agree.
because all the people who I've spoken to that have gone through adoption, they all have some kind of trauma.
Hmm.
And you need to know how to deal with it from a young age so that they can grow out of it and come out stronger and better
Hmm.
and more resilient for it.
Hmm. Agreed.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was an important and thought provoking conversation that we've had with Jean today. One thing that stood out to me is that adoption is never as simple as society often wants to make it. Love can exist and loss can exist at the very same time. Jean reminded us that adoption is not just a single event that happens on one day in a courtroom or a hospital. It can shape identity, attachment, relationships, and emotions for an entire lifetime, not only for the adoptee, but also for the birth parents and the adoptive parents. Today's conversation challenged all of us to ask difficult questions. Are we truly preparing adoptive parents for the emotional realities of bringing home a child who has already experienced separation and loss? Is adoption centered on the needs of the child, or too often on the needs of the adults? And what does a truly ethical, compassionate, and child-centered adoption look like moving forward? These are not easy conversations, but they are necessary ones. And here on Roots and Branches Adoption Stories, and on the Adoption Paradox website, Jean and I believe every side deserves to be heard with honesty, compassion, and respect. If today's episode touched you, challenged you, or made you think differently about adoption, I encourage you to share it with someone else. These conversations matter. You can find our episodes on YouTube at Roots and Branches Adoption Stories. And if you have an adoption story you'd like to share, you can reach out through our website at Roots and Branches Adoption Stories or call me directly at 615-870-6433. I'm Janet Munro here on KFred Radio, and this has been Roots and Branches Adoption Stories. Until next time, keep listening and keeping learning and keep making space for the stories that still need to be told. Thank you, Jean. I really appreciate you being with us today. Loved your story, and I'm sure when I finish your book, I'm going to have 1,000 more questions that we'll have to continue with. I look forward to that.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Janet. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for having me on your show, and thanks to all the listeners out there.